I do PowerPoint, I just don't do it well. So no color, no pictures, but I will speak to the slides. It's nice to be here. I'm originally from the US, Iowa, but I've been in South Africa 20 years. It's good to be home and engaging on these topics with you. I'm a philosopher. I do lots of work on the meaning of life, but I also do work in philosophies of the global south, so African philosophy, Chinese philosophy, particularly Confucian philosophy in East Asia, Latin American philosophy and the like. But a common theme through most of what I write on is the big question of how to live. And I take it there's overlap between that question in my field of philosophy and at least some parts of psychology, particularly when I speak of psychological theory in this talk or on the slides. What I have in mind is issues of psychological interventions. So I want to know what the ultimate point of, for example, psychotherapy is, and related interventions, so medicine, surgery. I'm often going to speak of therapy, but it's going to stand as a placeholder for the broader range of psychological interventions we might make. When we make such interventions, we're thinking about norms, right? We have some goal in mind. Some goals are better than others. And as a philosopher, I'd like to have a theoretical account of what we ultimately ought to be striving to achieve when we engage in therapy and related practices. So 2 claims I want to advance in this talk about that. First one is that if we try to understand the nature of mental health comprehensively, we're going to do a poor job if we reduce it to properties that are intrinsic to the individual, in the sense I'll spell out later in the talk. I'm going to argue that meaningful ways of relating are also constitutive of mental health, not merely a means to it. The second, somewhat bolder claim is that the proper aim of therapy isn't merely to promote mental health. I'm going to give you some reason to reconsider that claim, and instead to see that the proper aim of therapy being to foster meaning in a patient's life, where meaning may not be what promotes the patient's mental health. I think those 2 claims, if they're plausible, give you reason to doubt salient psychological theory from past nearly 100 years or so. Not all of it, but quite a lot of it. So if we survey accounts of what the proper aim of therapy ought to be from the Western literature, from at least since Freud, this is what stands out when I see the literature. So some maintain that the proper aim should be to feel pleasure without contortion. Others suggest it's to apprehend reality clearly, accurately. Others will speak of spontaneity or being autonomous or free or independent. Others will highlight being unique or creative. Still others will talk of feeling alive or experiencing vigor. Still others will, in the self-psychology tradition, will talk about manifesting a true, strong, or integrated self. Still more will talk about coping with anxiety or stressors, being able to rely on oneself, and finally, more recently, on the scene is mention of actualizing one's talents and developing virtues. That's not all you'll get, but that's an awful lot of what you'll get from Euro-American literature on the point of therapy and other psychological interventions. And when I see that list, I see 2 things. One is a kind of individualism. So these are conceptions of mental health that refer strictly to properties that are internal to the patient. There's no essential reference to another person other than the patient, and are in that sense individualist. Right? There might be relationships with others in the course of feeling alive or being free, but there's no essential tie, no essential relationality to these conceptions of mental health. Second thing I see is that, at least implicit in these discussions, is the claim that the sole point of therapy and related interventions is to produce mental health, right? These states. No others mentioned in these works that I can see. And in the following, I'm going to give you reason to doubt both of these claims. I'm going to suggest mental health isn't reducible to intrinsic properties of an individual patient, and I'm also going to give you some reason to think that the point of therapy isn't solely to promote the patient's health. And for both of these points, I'm going to appeal to considerations of meaning in life as understood by contemporary academic philosophers, particularly those in the English-speaking world. So when I need to tell you a bit about what I mean by meaning in life, or at least what I and my colleagues tend to mean by it, and by colleagues I mean English-speaking philosophers working in universities. Those of us who do research on meaning in life tend to think that it's something that's good for its own sake. So for example, we would draw a sharp divide between the meaning of a sentence on the one hand and the meaning of a life on the other. There's nothing inherently valuable about the meaning of a sentence. But when we talk about life's meaning or meaning in life, we're talking about something that's good for its own sake and that can be manifested in an individual's life to a varying degree. What's the nature of that value? Well, there's debate about that, but roughly, I think, it's the sort of way of living that merits reactions of esteem or pride or admiration. Right? It's those facets of a life that you would look back on your life and you'd feel proud of having done, or others at giving you a eulogy in your honor would admire you for having done. Typically, the next question is, well, what's that stuff? What's the sort of thing that merits pride or admiration? And most of us will refer to this sort of cluster of features. So many of us will say that what merits pride or esteem or admiration is something active. It's got to involve the exercise of intelligence or our rational nature, whatever's higher or qualitatively different from animals. And so the thought is the sort of stuff that merits pride or esteem isn't mere base pleasures, or isn't just simply getting whatever you want. We've spoken of the orgasmatron. That's one version of the experience machine, which Robert Nozick came up with in 1974. It is just a virtual reality device, basically. And we imagine you could enter such a device on your own for the rest of your life. Should you do it? Would you do it? Most of us would say no. Why not? If you really want to feel pleasure or be happy, the way to maximize your happiness would be to get in the machine, but very few of us would. Many of us working on the meaning of life say, well, the reason not to get in the machine for the rest of your life anyway, we might visit from time to time, is that that life would be lacking in meaning. Second feature of meaning talk for many of us philosophers is that it involves the realization of higher order ends. So the phrase that's often used is the good, the true, and the beautiful in the history of Western philosophy, where the good involves some kind of beneficent relationships, justice, charity, love for a family. The true involves education in the first instance, but could be a matter of self-understanding or wisdom. And then the beautiful, the arts, either making them or apprehending them, or more generally being creative. And the contrast here is with ends that are trivial or futile. One image in the literature from Susan Wolf is the blob. The blob sits at home alone, drinking beer and watching sitcoms. Could be pleasant to watch friends over beer, but probably not very meaningful, so many philosophers would say. Third feature that's recurrent in thinking about meaning as a value is narrativity. So there's something less meaningful about a repetitive life or a chaotic life, as it was put earlier today, or a life that declines over time. And Sisyphus is a key image, as Josh mentioned earlier today, of a repetition. Many of us think that a meaningful life, at least in part, is going to be one that has some kind of growth or perhaps some kind of redemption where we make good come from the bad. A fourth feature is sense-making, which was spoken of quite a lot today by psychological colleagues. Life seems more meaningful to some degree insofar as we have some reasonable way of comprehending our place in the world. And if we have radically false views of that, many of us have the intuition there's meaning lacking. And finally, you could have all of the above features, but still be lacking one dimension of meaning, which I'm putting under the heading of identification here. And a stereotypical 1950s housewife could be, using her rational nature and helping others and doing it in a way that makes for a good life story. And she could have a sense of herself in the world, but she might just really hate what she's doing and feel like it's not her, in which case she would be lacking some meaning. So philosophers debate about which of these are essential or the most important. I'm just lumping them all together as a cluster or an amalgam, and we'll pick from them as I need. So notice, this is a value. This is supposed to be a way of living that's good for its own sake. It's not a linguistic or symbolic kind of meaning on the one hand, and it's also not merely judging that your life is meaningful on the other. For a very large majority of us philosophers, you can be mistaken about whether your life or your activities are meaningful. They're not going to be meaningful if you are the blob, or you are Sisyphus, or you're in the experience machine, for example. So, I've told you what I mean by meaning in life. Let's put that idea to work in the rest of the talk. First aim of the talk was to show you that if we want to understand the nature of mental illness comprehensively, or conversely health, we can't do it if we appeal merely to properties that are intrinsic to the patient. I went through DSM-5 and picked these things out, and I can pick more out, but this is a good list to get going. Consider those. I'm not going to go through them. They're going to be familiar to those of you in the psychological literature. Those are all widely taken as mental illnesses. What do they stand out? For me, what stands out about them, why these count as mental illnesses, is these people can't relate. That's the fundamental problem with these illnesses. It isn't that they're lacking freedom, or it isn't merely that they're lacking vigor, or that they're not creative. The straightforward thing to say about these folks is that they're not able to relate in a certain way. I've got a hunch about what that way is. I think it involves a certain broad conception of love or friendliness, which involves enjoying a sense of togetherness with others, participating with them on an even-handed basis, helping them, and doing so out of sympathy and for their sake. That's a rough reconstruction of what many philosophers would characterize as friendliness or love, and I think we can go back to the previous slide, and I could show you, if I had time, that for each of those mental illnesses, they're lacking 2 or 3 of these features. So the problem is folks who suffer from those conditions can't love. They can't be friendly, and that's part of mental health. If we consider classic images of meaningless lives, they involve solitariness, they involve distance. So we've already spoken of the orgasmatron and the experience machine and the blob, and we can add to that a cocaine addict who is wrapped up in his or her own desires or aversion to pain, and we can think of solitary confinement in a jail as a classic example of a lack of meaning. My suggestion is that the mental illnesses I listed a couple slides ago are analogous to these conditions. What they've got in common is that people are distanced. They can't come closer to each other. So the suggestion at the bottom of the slide is a person is more mentally healthy, at least in part, the more she's able to participate in meaningful relationships with others. So that's the first claim, which is against individualism. Right? Meaningful ways of relating are central to mental health. Didn't say they're exhaustive. I don't think it's the whole story, but it's an essential part of the story if you want a comprehensive account. Now, for the next 10 minutes, I'm going to focus on the second claim. I'm going to suggest that even given an attractive conception of mental health, it shouldn't be the only thing we strive to promote if we are psychotherapists or otherwise engaging in psychological interventions. And time permitting, I'll go through 5 different reasons to think there's something other than mental health that's worth striving for in a therapeutic context. Here's the first one. Suppose a patient wants to sacrifice his or her mental health for the sake of others, and specifically their mental health or other kinds of health. So suppose somebody wants to soldier on in a caring profession, wants to serve as a nurse in a cancer ward. And suppose, in terms of her mental health, it would be bad for her to continue in that profession. She'd be better off getting another one. Still, that's what she wants to do. I think it could be appropriate for a therapist to help her do it, even if the therapist knew ahead of time that she'd be better off switching careers. Another example is doing the best for one's kids in a bad marriage. Right? Suppose it's just 2 or 3 more years until the kids are ready to leave the house, and that would be best for them. It would be best to divorce once they're out, and you want to continue on until that time. Again, if the therapist knows that you'd be best off getting out of the marriage now, it would still be reasonable, I think, for the therapist to help you stay in it and make the best of it and achieve your goals of doing the best for your children. So if we assume, for the sake of argument, that there'd be some loss of mental health by making these kinds of sacrifices, it can still be appropriate, I think, for a psychotherapist to help a patient engage in these activities because of her interest in a kind of meaningful beneficence. Second counterexample. Suppose somebody wants to sort of trade in his mental health. Right? So imagine a package of mental health or a package of mental illness, and suppose you've got a patient who just wants to trade in for a new one where there's no net difference in health or illness after the trade. So for one example, suppose you've got an introverted creative type, and that person just wants to be more extroverted and helpful to others. Or you've got a person suffering from narcissism who wants to let go of that illness and would rather take over the depressive one. If we assume for the sake of argument there'd be no gain, no decrease in mental illness or no gain in mental health, still I think it could be appropriate for a therapist to help somebody undergo this transition. Why? I think the natural thing to say is that the person has an interest in a meaningful identity. A person might just think it's better in some way or have some kind of inclination to want to be more extroverted and helpful, even though he knows he's not going to be any more mentally healthy as a result of it. Or somebody, perhaps somebody identifies as a goth and wants to be a little moody and dark and would rather have the depressive neurosis as opposed to the narcissistic one. Thinks it's better to harm him or herself than others, for example. I think transitioning personality can be an appropriate aim of a therapist, apart from considerations of mental health or mental illness. And again, considerations of meaning are one way to capture that interest. Third counterexample. I think it can be appropriate for a therapist to help a patient achieve her religious goals. So if she's got a conception of what she thinks is her God-given purpose, or she thinks she needs to do certain things, abide by a religious text to show her devotion to God, I think it can be appropriate for a therapist to help the patient achieve those ends, even if we assume, for the sake of argument again, it would mean some marginal cost to her mental health. For an example, suppose she believes her God wants her to slaughter a sheep with one of those big knives, and she's struggling to deal with that. It's causing her a lot of anxiety. She's going to have guilt after doing it. Still, it could be reasonable for a therapist to help her through that in order to maintain a sense of her place in the world and to sustain a meaningful identity, supposing she's invested in this religious tradition. 2 more. Life bummers. Suppose you have a patient who wants to reflect on the unjust or apparently unjust distribution of suffering and other harm in the world. Innocent people die and suffer greatly. Toddlers get cancer. And it doesn't look good in terms of the evidence for surviving these bodies. Suppose the patient wants to reflect on these matters and what they mean to her. And suppose, again, the therapist knows ahead of time going in, it's just going to cause you anxiety. You'll be better off if we ignore these things and paper them over. Still, I think it would be reasonable for a therapist to delve into these things at some cost to a patient's mental health, however you want to cash that out. Why? Again, sense-making, our place in the world, understanding where we are, having some kind of coherent sense of making our lives intelligible in the face of evidence. But the other thing is narrativity. Having some pattern in your life is going to be affected by your beliefs on whether you're going to survive the death of your body or not. And so an interest in having a good life story might mean facing death square in the face, even if, again, we suppose for the sake of argument, it would come at some cost to mental health. And finally, a little closer to home for me, I think it can be appropriate for a therapist to help a patient in a decolonial society do what she believes would appease angry ancestors and sustain what she believes are her exhaustively relational self. Let me define some terms. So at least in the African context, many people believe that once you die, you have a self that continues, but it doesn't go somewhere else. It stays on Earth, usually in a particular place that can be identified. And some of these individuals who've survived the deaths of their bodies are ancestors. They have quite a lot of power. They founded the clan. They've got moral wisdom, and they police the norms, and you don't want to piss them off. A second thing on relational self. When we think of the self in the West, we tend to think of it as something intrinsic or internal to us. So you might identify it as your soul or your brain, but most commonly what we do is we think of ourselves in terms of our psychological states, right? Our values, our desires, our likes, our beliefs, what we can remember. But many indigenous peoples outside of the West don't think of the self that way. And in particular, many indigenous Africans think of the self relationally. That who you are is not a function of something internal, but rather your relationships with others. Who you are is a function of with whom you are relating at a given time. And that view is common not merely in Africa, actually, but also East Asia. So let's do some more supposing now. Let's suppose, for the sake of argument, there aren't any ancestors, and let's suppose the self isn't entirely relational in the way these indigenous peoples believe. Let's suppose instead that the Western view is right, that a lot of us, at least a chunk of ourselves, is intrinsic. But let's suppose that there had been a colonial power that had denigrated the indigenous belief systems. So not merely neglected them, but treated them as inferior, as unchristian, as pre-modern, whatever else. The colonial power has been kicked out. There's a new government that's funding a public healthcare system that includes therapy. And now we suppose, for the sake of argument, that working with these beliefs, accepting them, right, supposing there are ancestors, supposing the self is entirely relational, would mean some cost to the person's mental health, however conceived. What are you, as a therapist, being paid by the state to do? Well, you got two options. On the one hand, you could just refuse to engage with anything about ancestors and relational selves on the grounds that it's not going to foster the mental health of the patient. But to do that would be just to reinforce, it looks on the face of it, the kind of epistemic injustice that was done to the indigenous peoples in the first place. So your other alternative is to work with these beliefs, even if it makes it comes at some cost, not too much, I don't think, but even if it comes at some cost to patient mental health on grounds of the patient's identity, if those are the kinds of beliefs she holds, and on grounds of justice. Remember the triad of the good, the true, and the beautiful. At least one good thing is justice, and a certain kind of justice we've been discussing, at least amongst philosophers for the past 10 years, is epistemic. So it would be a way for the state to pay back indigenous peoples if it gave some weight to their beliefs, even if the beliefs are false, and even if it would come at some cost to mental health. There's some balancing process to do there. And again, I submit considerations of meaning do a good job of capturing those kinds of considerations. Last slide. My big hunch, which I haven't done anything, which I haven't supported really today, is that if there's a single final end for psychotherapy and related interventions, it's the aim of fostering meaning in patients' lives. And that's it, nothing else. In support of that hypothesis, some support today, I've argued that being able to relate meaningfully with others accounts for quite a wide array of our intuitions about what counts as a mental illness and conversely forms of mental health. And I've also argued, given you 5 reasons for thinking that the aim of a therapist shouldn't be to foster mental health alone, however you understand that. If I were going to make good on the big hunch, I would give you one further piece of the puzzle. I would show you that considerations of meaning can account for the intrinsic features of mental illness and mental health that are really well captured by those Western psychological theories that I listed earlier. I haven't done any of that today, but I've done a little bit elsewhere. I want to close by pointing out that I think a chunk of this talk is probably due to my having lived in Africa for about 20 years. It's not always pleasant to live away from home. It can be hard. But one good thing about it is you are exposed to new ideas and different perspectives. And I remember when I read this line in the middle of the slide that, quote, there's an overemphasis of health promotion and disease prevention practices in the medical model of the West. I remember reading that and just having my perspective of the world shifted a bit. It was strange to think that there might be some point to medicine or mental psychotherapy and the like other than making people better when it comes to their health. Perhaps you've had a similar shift of perspective today.